Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Brandon Minnick, and in this session, we'll be talking about the .NET MAUI Community Toolkits, which, in my opinion, are essential for every .NET MAUI developer. Now, before we get going, I'm curious, how many folks here are already using .NET MAUI? OK, a couple folks, great. How many folks are already using the toolkits? All right, even better. Anybody use Xamarin back in the day? I love it. OK, great. This is going to be fun then. I actually used to work at Xamarin. For folks who have never heard of Xamarin, don't worry about it. That's not what this talk is about. It was a small startup based in San Francisco. Microsoft acquired us back in 2016 and took the Xamarin technology that allows us to make iOS and Android apps in C# and essentially rebranded it as .NET MAUI. So that's why we're talking about that today. But yeah, I should say also, yeah, I'm very biased on all these topics because, like I said, I used to work at Xamarin, and I stayed at Microsoft for about 7 years. I'm at AWS now. But when I was at Microsoft, I was the one who created the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit. So I think it's great. I think everybody should use it. Hopefully by the end of today, you'll also agree. But yes, I am very, very biased. But that being said, I do want to highlight a couple links you'll see on the bottom of the slides today. Now's the time to take out your phone, grab a picture of this slide right here, because on this website, well, my website, codetraveler.io, this is where you can find everything that we're talking about today. So you don't have to worry about taking notes. You don't have to worry about memorizing anything, because if you just head to codetraveler.io/community-toolkit, or you can just scan that QR code, it goes to the same place. That's where you can find all the resources. So I have a bunch of videos there that I've recorded on the Community Toolkit that cover the topics we talk about today. I've got the slides posted there. I've got links to all of the open source repositories, because the toolkits are all open source. They're all up on GitHub. And tons of links, resources if you want to learn more and keep going with your journey into .NET MAUI and using the Community Toolkit. And there on the bottom left, that's my Twitter handle. If you want to stay plugged into the latest updates on Community Toolkit, feel free to give me a follow on either Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. And every time we publish a new release, I'll tweet it out. And that way you can stay plugged in. We also have a monthly stand-up. So there's about a dozen core maintainers, all of us from various members of the community, that we all volunteer our time to work on the Community Toolkit, and we meet once a month. We live stream it to the .NET Foundation YouTube channel, and so if you ever want to catch those videos, you'll also see me tweet them out. I'll post it on LinkedIn, so if you want to, you can follow along, stay plugged in, but let's get rolling. So like I mentioned a second ago, .NET MAUI is basically the evolution of Xamarin Forms. If you used Xamarin Forms back in the day, then you're pretty familiar with .NET MAUI. But like I said, we're not talking about Xamarin today. We're talking .NET MAUI. And at the essence of what .NET MAUI is, it's a cross-platform mobile UI framework. Well, I guess not just mobile, because you can make iOS, Android, Windows, and macOS apps all in C#, and they're all totally native. The way this technology works under the hood is every time iOS comes out with a new release, the engineers at Microsoft take that iOS SDK and wrap every single API so that we can access them in C#. Likewise with Android, every time a new Android release comes out, the engineers at Microsoft wrap that up so that we can access it in C#. And that way we can still build a totally native app. So what I mean by that is when you click compile, you're compiling down to all the native bits. When you run it on these devices, the phone has no idea you wrote your code in C#. And with that, we get a lot of the native performance benefits. We get a lot of the native UI controls and defaults. So you have a very familiar look and feel on Android versus iOS. And it's one of the few services that does it like that. So for example, Flutter, you're actually not using any of the native UI for Flutter. Flutter gives you a blank canvas, and you literally it just paints on controls. It looks like it's the native UI. It's really not. But with .NET MAUI, under the hood, it's all just the same APIs that if you ever made an app in Objective-C, Swift, or Java, or Kotlin, it's the same thing. The only slight difference on those APIs is we do C#ify them a little bit. So the Java world, they still love their get set methods, whereas we have properties. So we'll take those and turn them into properties instead of leaving them as getter and setter methods. And we might take a string and make it an enum. But for all intents and purposes, if you've ever done any iOS or Android development in Java, Kotlin, or Objective-C, Swift, pretty much the same idea. And also, it's cross-platform, meaning we can write our code once, and then that same code will run natively on every single platform that we see here. And what I mean by that is, if I, in my code, say, center a button in the middle of the screen, well, when I compile that down to Android, that button compiles down to a native Android widget button. Whereas when I compile that down on iOS, that compiles down to an UI button, which is the native iOS control. So you get the same look and feel, and this is one of the things I love about it, because Android and iOS, they have slightly different design paradigms, and that's what our users are used to. So if you're an Android user and if you ever launched an app and it's fine, but it looks a little weird, and like the buttons are maybe in a strange place, well, it's probably because they're following the iOS design guidelines. And same thing on iOS. Like, all of the Google apps are really notorious for this. They design them the same for both platforms, and like it works, but it might take you an extra second to find something. And we can actually see that here. If you look closely on the iOS and Android headers right at the top, you can see that, well, if you look really closely, you can see that the fonts are different because it's different default fonts on Android versus iOS. And likewise, that header on the Android app, that's left justified, whereas iOS, that's centered, and that's all just by default. So we get all these goodies for free because, again, they're just totally native apps using all the native APIs. But if you do have a designer and that designer insists that the apps have to look identical, that's totally cool too. You can customize it however you want. But with .NET MAUI, anything you can do in Java, Kotlin, Objective-C, or Swift, we can do in C# with .NET MAUI. OK. But we're here to talk about the .NET Community Toolkits. So there are 3 community toolkits, and we're going to run through all these today. We'll even jump into some code to show them off. The first one is communitytoolkit.maui. And I should say these are all open source. They're all available on NuGet. These are the names on NuGet. So if you search communitytoolkit.maui today, that's what you'll find. The Maui Community Toolkit contains a lot of goodies that don't necessarily come included in .NET MAUI. And that's not a fault of .NET MAUI. It would be the same on iOS or Android. There's certain UI elements that we have to add to all of our apps. Like, how many times have we had to add a profile picture, like a little avatar view and a circle with a photo in it? Pretty much every app has that, right? But iOS and Android don't give that to us out of the box. So the idea behind the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit is, why don't we write that code for you? So you can download our library, take advantage of all the stuff we've already built, so that you don't have to copy-paste your code and rewrite everything yourself or reinvent the wheel. And it's also totally open source. So if you want to contribute back, we'd love to. We are all volunteers on the Community Toolkit team. It's just a passion project. There's about a dozen of us that just do it in our free time. We donate our nights and weekends. We take time away from our families to do this. So keep that in mind. If you do find a bug, absolutely let us know. But be kind, give us some grace. None of us get paid to do this work. Sometimes we'll get some really nasty people in there like, I can't believe this issue's been open for 90 days. I can't publish. And it's like, hey, just so you know, we're all just volunteers. And also, could you submit a pull request? Like, you're in the community too, right? So it's totally run by the community. Like I said, I still lead the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit team, even though I work at AWS now. There are 2 Microsoft employees on our core maintainer team, but probably 90+% of the code has been written and contributed by non-Microsoft community members. CommunityToolkit.mvvm. We also call this the MVVM Community Toolkit. This one's really cool because one of the big problems with MVVM is we have to rewrite a lot of code. There's a lot of boilerplate code that we got to do just to get MVVM working, right? Like, we've got our model, we've got our view model, we've got our view, but what ends up happening is we usually take that model, and then we have to break it out and separate those properties in our view model just so that the view can bind to them. And then for bindings, we've got to implement INotifyPropertyChanged. We've got to call setProperty. We've got to do all this funky stuff with MVVM that it's all the same code every time. And we're just writing extra keystrokes for, well, not for no reason because we need it, but what if we didn't have to? Well, that's what the MVVM Community Toolkit helps us with. And then lastly, we have communitytoolkit.maui.markup. This is a library that, well, we'll say fun fact, you don't have to use XAML to create your UIs. And in fact, I don't. I've never used XAML in any of my apps. The apps that I've published to the App Store have all been in purely C#. And I recommend that. If you already know XAML, that's totally cool. If you're good at it, you love it, there's no problems. But one of the things I always found interesting with Xamarin, now .NET MAUI, was the whole value proposition, right? Is like create native iOS and Android apps in C#. And then you go, OK, great, I'm going to create my first app. And it goes, here's a XAML. And you're like, the heck is XAML? So now you have to learn a new language, or somebody new joins your team. You have that extra learning curve. Which, again, if it works and you love it, great, no problem. But you can do everything in C#, and that's a helper library for you. So let's jump into the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit and talk about some of these features. We'll be showing off these today in one of our sample apps. So the first one here, we have some alerts. Toast, snack bar. If those words mean nothing to you, that's OK. They're funny words. But if you ever used an app and you've seen a little notification pop up on the bottom, like email sent, and then it disappears, that's a toast. And toast comes out of the box on Android, but it doesn't come out of the box on iOS or Windows or Mac. So we've created a cross-platform toast for you that you can add to your apps. Use it from the Community Toolkit to show those alerts to your users. Snack bar is the same thing. Snack bar is just a toast with a button. So if you want the user to action on something, you can have that button fire a command. Happy days. We have tons and tons of behaviors. Behaviors in .NET MAUI are things you can bolt on to a UI control to add some extra functionality. So things like email validation, right? How many times do you have a text box in your app? The user has to enter in their email, like you got a sign-in page, a login page, whatever it is. And with the email validation behavior, you bolt this on to your text box, to your entry. And then as the user's typing, the text can, say, remain red until that email address is valid. And then it can turn green or default back to black. Or you can have functionality to where it'll trigger or enable a submit button. So that's something that, again, most apps have to do something like this, but it doesn't come out of the box. And I'll tell you what, this is, because I have made this behavior. Actually, I wrote most of the code in the community toolkits. But the email validation was wild. Like, there's whole RFCs with specs on like what's a valid email address and what's not. I had no idea. Like, did you guys know? So for example, you could send me an email at brandon@codetraveler.io. Or if you know the IP address for my server, you can say Brandon at, and then you can plug in my IPv4 or IPv6 IP address, and that's a valid email. I had no idea. So email is crazy complicated, but don't worry, we've got an email validation for you. Mask behavior, that's another fun one. So masking, you're basically taking what the user types in and kind of modifying how the text looks. So if you have, say, like a phone number field, and maybe you want spaces or dashes or parentheses around certain parts of it, or a plus sign, you can configure the mask behavior to basically do that automatically as they just type in their phone number. And probably one of the most popular ones is the touch behavior. So there's a lot of UI controls in .NET MAUI, like buttons, that do already have touch controls built in. So when you put a button on the screen, the user taps it, that button fires an event. Well, a lot of them don't. So let's say you have an image. Let's say you have a label, and you want something to happen when the user taps on that. Well, no worries. You can bolt on touch behavior, and you're good to go. Converters. Oh, if you've ever done MVVM stuff, you've probably had to make a converter. And they're a pain to make. They're really ugly because you have to go create a new class that inherits from iValueConverter just to do something simple like taking the value from your view model and maybe flipping the bit on the bool to make true false. You have to make a whole other class to do that. The iValueConverter interface is not type safe, so you're just passing around objects and casting them and hoping the cast is right and doesn't crash your app. Well, we have tons and tons of converters here for you. Like I said, the most popular one's probably that inverted bool converter. So if you have something in your view model like isBusy, you have a isBusy property that gets set to true anytime you save something to the database or make an API call. And let's say you want to disable a button on the screen while that thing is sending. Well, on the button, the property is called isEnabled. So you have to set isEnabled to false, but in your view model, the property is called isBusy, and that'll be true. So no worries, you can just slap in the inverted bool converter, and then you're good to go. We have tons and tons of extensions. So some of the most popular ones, we have service collection extensions. So if you ever made a MAUI app before, it always starts in that MAUI program.cs file where you have your builder services workflow, right? So it's like builder.services.addTransient. So we've added a couple, like you can say add transient with shell route. So if you're using shell, if you know what that is, there's routing strings you can pass in, and instead of placing those strings somewhere else in maybe your shell file, you can keep them all together right in the same file. Another really cool one that I don't know if enough people use or appreciate, but I love it, is the color animation. In .NET MAUI, there's all these animation extension methods, like there's .fade_to, which will change the opacity to make something appear or disappear. Or there's rotate_to, that'll rotate, and there's translate_to, that'll move your UI element around the screen. So we made one called .color_to, and it's really cool because instead of, say, changing a color from like red to green, which can be kind of jarring, it'll actually go through the color spectrum and morph into the new color. It's really cool. I'll show you that one later because, like I said, it's one of my favorites. And then we've got a couple layouts. So .NET MAUI comes with a bunch of layouts out of the box. There's grid, there's vertical stack layout, horizontal stack layout, absolute layout. Well, we've added a couple that you might be interested in, might want to use, like dock layout. So dock layout, you can pin stuff to either the top, the left or right, or bottom of the screen. So basically like docking something to the top. There's state container. So this is one where if you think of your code like a state machine, and we were talking about isBusy earlier. So like if isBusy is true, maybe you want to show a completely different UI. You don't want to just put a little spinning indicator. Maybe you've got a cool graphic that animates. Well, with state container, you can define different states for the UI on that page, and then based off what you're binding to in the view model, you can have it show different UI elements. And then the last one, uniform items layout, kind of exactly what it sounds like. It'll just put things on the screen all equally spaced. So if you have a UI like that where you need like that kind of checkerboard look, then that's an easy one where you just add in the views, and we take care of that for you. Speaking of views, we've got a bunch of views. These are arguably the most popular things in the toolkit. I mentioned avatar view earlier, where again, like you just got to show a profile picture, right? Well, okay, what's that mean? I got to go create my own border control, and I got to round the corners, and I got to do the math. Nope, you can just use avatar view. It's actually super cool. You don't even have to use a circle. You could customize it. You could make it a square. You can make it a star, whatever shape you want. I've even seen apps that they showed like 5-star ratings using avatar view, and instead of using an image, they just fill in a yellow star. So lots of opportunities there. One of our most popular ones is camera view. So if you have a need where the user's got to take a picture of something in your app, slap in camera view, and then in that view, you'll see exactly what the user, your user will see what their camera sees, assuming they gave you permission to access the camera. And then we have functionality where you have a button. When they tap that button, you can fire capture async on the camera view. We'll snap that picture. We serve it to you, the developer, as a stream that you can do whatever you want with. You can save it to the phone, library, upload to the cloud. DrawingView is another cool one. It's just literally just a view that allows the user to draw with their finger. And so this one's really popular if you ever have a signature line at the bottom of a form and somebody needs to sign off on something. So you just put in the drawing view, they'll sign there, and just like with camera view, you can save that as a stream, do whatever you want with it. Probably the other really big popular ones are MediaElement and Popup. Kind of do exactly what they sound like, right? MediaElement allows you to play a video in your app or an audio file, and Popup will basically display a pop-up on the screen, and it also dims the background, so it really draws the user's attention to the front, and so they can't tap anything behind it while it's awake or while it's showing. Okay, there's way more, by the way. We could spend all day, all week talking about the features of Community Toolkit, but we don't have that much time. So let's talk about the MVVM toolkit, or Community Toolkit.mvvm is the name of the NuGet package. This is the one I was talking about earlier that will save you so many keystrokes, save you from writing all of that boilerplate code for MVVM. Because in MVVM, we have to implement iNotify property changed, and we have to create a property with a backing field, and then the setter of the property. We usually call a method called setProperty that sees if, uses that equality comparer to see if anything's changed, and if it does, it fires the event. And we just copy paste all that code from app to app. Well, with the MVVM toolkit, you don't have to do any of that anymore, because we can take advantage of these attributes. So let's look at this one down here first. We've got a private string first name field. And just by adding that observable property attribute above it, the MVVM Community Toolkit uses source generators to then create that property for you. So that property now exists. You didn't have to write it. And that property will do all the equality comparisons. It'll fire iNotify property changed. And so in your code, all you have to say is private string first name. You slap on observable property attribute. And then down here, you can see this public string full name is calling first name with a capital F. But we didn't write first name with a capital F. We just have a field with a lowercase f. But the Community Toolkit wrote that for us. So it's also smart enough to know to capitalize the first letter. Or if you're like me, I like to use underscores for my fields. It's also smart enough to know to remove that underscore and capitalize the letter. Really, really good stuff, because you can also do things like, for example, full name is referencing both first name and last name, but there's no way for full name for us to set the property on full name. It's a read-only property. And so anytime first name or last name changes, we also want to tell the UI, we also want to notify change for full name. And you can do that super easy. You add that attribute, says also notify change for, you pass in the name of that property, full name, and now anytime first name changes, you'll get a iNotify property changed alert for first name and full name. And then if we look up above, we've got a command. So again, MVVM, we love using commands, we bind to them, but really all a command is doing is firing a method. Like commands, we just new up a command and we point it to a method. So why do all that when all you need to do is add in an attribute right above the method that you want to create a command for? So for example, we have a private void greet user command. By adding that relay command attribute, the MVVM Community Toolkit, its source generators automatically create a command, an iCommand for me. And it's smart enough, it knows that I need to pass in a user as a parameter, so it'll require that. And if you need to do things like can execute, you can do that as well. Really, really cool stuff, really, really powerful stuff. And just to show you an example, this is one of the apps that I have in the App Store. It's an app called Get Trends. And this was my pull request from when I added in the MVVM toolkit. And you can see here, I got to delete over 650 lines of code, and basically just replacing all that boilerplate code with a couple attributes. And I don't know about you guys, but anytime there's a PR that removes more code than it adds, that's good PR. And I should also mention, the MVVM toolkit is the only one we're talking about today that's actually not dependent on .NET MAUI. So if you're using WPF, WinForms, UWP, whatever, as long as it's a .NET app and you want to do MVVM with it, you can use communitytoolkit.mvvm. OK, and the last one, the third one we're talking about today, communitytoolkit.MAUI Markup. Like I mentioned, you don't have to use XAML to create your UIs. You can do them all in C#. And fun fact, you'll get a little bit of a performance boost, because XAML is interpreted at runtime, whereas C# is compiled ahead of time. So that same UI you create in XAML will be a little slower than the same UI created in C#. We're not talking about seconds. We're dozens of milliseconds, but a little bit of performance bump. But what this library does, what communitytoolkit.MAUI.markup does, is provides a bunch of these fluent extension methods. Because you can always create this UI as just saying, like, var entry equals new entry, entry.text equals. And then you can have all this code, and it's fine. That's how I made my first apps. But we created this so that you get this nice fluent syntax that's super easy to read. You'll see in the sample app I'll show you in a minute. It reads really nicely, top to bottom, left to right. And you get to take advantage of some really cool features because, again, everything's in C#. So like your bindings, for example, we've got that search view model binding. in XAML, that's just a magic string. You type in the name of the property. You hope you don't have any typos, because it has to match the name of the property in the view model. But here, we're just doing it in C#. So I can just point exactly to the property that I want to bind to. And everything's type safe. This is also really good for refactoring. If you've ever done changed property names in your view model, like you right-click, say rename or refactor, and you change the name, well, a lot of times in XAML, you have to remember to go back and update that property binding in XAML. But here, since everything's in C#, since we're all using the actual types, that type name will change here for you. So another one of the reasons I love using C# for everything is we can take advantage of all the goodies we get in Visual Studio. And if we look down below, I'm creating a new button. I'm assigning the text that says search. I can say .center. That will call both horizontal and vertical alignment, tell them to the center, so we can do that in one line of code, super easy. And then down here in our binding, what we see is a converter, but it's inline. So we were talking about converters earlier, and yes, we have a ton in the Community Toolkit, and you can still use them here in C#. Or instead of trying to create your own I-value converter and going through all that mess, just pass in a function. And look how easy this is to read, it is to understand. Like, we're binding to the button's isEnabled property. Our source is that entry we created above by using that assign method to output the variable as a variable I also called entry. And then what we do is to see, do we enable the button? Well, let's check first to see if that text length is not 0. Let's make sure they put some text in the field before we enable that button. And again, it's all type safe, so we know that the parameter for the converter is going to be a string, because that's what entry.text is, and we know it has to return a bool, because that's what isEnabled uses. So you get to take advantage of all the reasons we love C#, and like I said, you do get a little performance bump. OK, so let's check out some of the documentation. So if we just Google MAUI Toolkit docs, this is literally what I do to go find it. It's usually the top result, but yeah, I just want to show you here, all of our documentation is on the official Microsoft repo. This was something that I pushed really hard for when I was creating the Community Toolkit back when I worked at Microsoft, because it helps with a couple things. It helps with visibility, so it helps make it easier for you to find our docs. It's always going to be one of the top search results, because they get a lot of SEO through the Microsoft docs, and it also kind of gives us that nod from Microsoft. Like, we don't work for Microsoft. They don't pay me to work on this. Like, I wish they did. But it kind of lets you know as a user that, like, this is recommended by Microsoft. So if you come in here, you can dig through all these. We take a lot of pride in our documentation. And so for all these docs, if there's a platform-specific initialization, like on Windows, for Snack Bar and Toast, you got to do a lot of stuff on Windows. Windows makes it really difficult. So we'll show you how to set up your app, and then we show you some syntax. Here it is in C#, and we'll even show a little image of the toast appearing and disappearing. So that's the toast I was talking about earlier. And if we let's check out other ones, like this email validation behavior, right? This is the one I was mentioning earlier. Like, here's how you use it in XAML. Here's how you can use it in C#, the old-fashioned way. Or here's how you can use it in C# with the fancy way, with the C# markup library. And then down here, you can see what I was talking about earlier. So you can tell it to have an invalid style, where that text color property is red. And then once it's valid, we can change it to green. And then as the user's typing in, voila, as soon as they enter in a valid email address, it turns green, and everybody's happy. So that's always where you can find these. These docs are also open source. So if you ever find a bug in them, feel free to, well, I should show you. It's this edit button right here at the top. So you can always edit this button. You can submit a pull request, help us fix any typos, or maybe we missed a semicolon somewhere. But always appreciate the help. All right, so now let's actually jump into the code. Let's stop talking about it. Let's actually check out an app here I've made using the Community Toolkits. So this is just a pretty simple game. It's just one page, and all you got to do is tap this button, and we see how many times you can tap it within 5 seconds. So you see a little counter counting down at the bottom. You can see my taps incrementing. And then here, that's a little pop-up from the Community Toolkit. So that's what our pop-up looks like. And then that pop-up lets me know that my score was 7. And I mentioned that color, color 2 animation extension. If I zoom in here, let's see how well this shows up. If I can get a high score, I'll just tap this button as fast as I can. We should get a high score now. There we go. So new high score, I got 33. And then look at the color here on the high score. See, it's green. And then watch it fade back to its original color. Pretty cool, right? It's one of those things that just, it adds like a little bit of polish to your app, makes it look really nice for the user. They might not even realize it, but subconsciously they appreciate it, and I do too. OK, so let's check out the code for this app, because like I said, I want to show you this example of creating the UI in C#. So what I have here is a class that I've called the tap game page. And super similar, if you're already familiar with XAML, the content page has a property called content. And so we set the content here in the constructor. And so what I've done is I said that this content is a grid. And if we look at the UI side by side, we set our row spacing, but the row definitions here, this is one of my favorite things about doing it in C#, is we can name our rows. This is the thing I hate most. Well, there's a lot of things I hate most in XAML. One of the things I hate the most in XAML is when you define a grid, you just put in these numbers, right? You just say, like, the rows are 52, 108, star, whatever it is, and then that scrolls off the screen, you're down here in the code, and you're like, oh, shoot, is this entry in row 4? Or wait, but you count it starting at 0, so it's the 4th row, but it's row number 3. That trips me up all the time in XAML. So since we're here in C#, what we can do is we can just create a custom enum like I've done down here. So I have an enum that defines all my rows, like this is my high score row, my description row, my tap button row, my tap counter. And then up here, we can assign these values. So just like you might do in XAML, you can say the row high score is going to be 52 points tall. The description row is 108 points tall. The tap button is star. That means it's proportional. So for example, if the description row is also star, then the description row and the tap button row would be proportionally equal to each other. The way all this works is it takes all of these absolute values, and then however much space is left on the UI, it splits it up between the two. Or heck, maybe you want the tap button to be twice as big. You can say it's 2 stars. And so not only is it super easy to define our rows, but when we get down here to where we're adding children to the grid, now this tap game label, I can just add it to row.highscore. Again, I don't have to remember that this is going to be row 0 or row 1. And especially when you're refactoring your app, the product manager comes to you and like, hey, we've got to add in another button, but it's a grid, which means now you have to add a new row, and it's going to throw everything off. Nope. If it's all in C#, you have type-safe named rows. You can just come into that enum down here, add that new row in, and then you're still good to go. So like I said, I love the way this looks. I love the way this reads. It's really nice to see just this new tap game label. This is actually a custom class. I just created a class that inherits from label because all these labels had a lot of similarities. Like, they were all going to use the same text color. They all wanted them both to be centered. I wanted the text to be centered on both of them. And so instead of doing that every time, I just created a custom class called tap game label. But at a glance, we can see that, there we are, that our tap game label is in the high score row. We can even assign it to a variable like right here. And then we have our bindings for our text property. And again, you can see that inline converter where that value in my view model, this high score, this is actually an int. But what I want to show on the screen is high score colon. So again, it knows everything's type safe. It knows that this static number is going to be an int. So if I do something like this, that works too. It just telling me I don't need it, but it knows we're getting an int in, we're returning a string, because everything's type safe. Happy days. Love it. So as we scroll down here, we'll see a couple other cool things. Like, so some of these, and this is definitely my fault, I haven't added methods for everything. So if you're using this library and you're like, man, I wish there was an extension method for line break mode. Me too. But again, I don't get paid to do this. And so I got to make time for it. But if you have the time, submit me a pull request. We'll merge it in. But you can see how we can set the font, set the text. And then this button, again, this is just a custom class I made that inherits from button because I didn't want to clutter up the UI definition up in the constructor. But here in button, you can see we're binding to that button's text property. And we have another method called bind command that allows you to pass in both a getter to point to the command in your view model, and then also, if you have a parameter you want to include, then you have your parameter getter and your parameter binding mode, your command binding mode. So should all feel nice at home, should be super easy to read. I mean, you can do things like set the size. You just say, I want this 250 by 250 points tall by 250 points high, and you're good to go. So let's actually jump over into the view model, because this is where things are going to get fun. Because the view model, I have not implemented the MVVM toolkit yet. So if we scroll down, a lot of this code will probably look really familiar, right? Like we create commands, and we got to new them up here. And this command has a can execute property that's pointing to one of our Boolean properties, and all of our bools, we have to call set property on. We got to implement iNotify property changed. Well, let's go through this. Let's actually refactor this to see how we can make this code way, way better. So why don't we start here with this one, this bool, can game button tapped command execute. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically saying, is the command enabled or disabled? And so what we can do, we add in this observable property attribute. And the first thing that happens, and this happens to me every time because I always forget, is it's warning me that, OK, now we got two definitions of this tap game view model. And that's because the way source converters work, or source generators work, is we have to use partial classes. So what I do here is I add in partial. So now we have partial class tap game view model. And if I zoom out, we're going to have more red squiggles down here, because now this is yelling at me saying, hey, there's already another property declared, can game button tapped command execute. So now we can delete this. But before we do, let's see. So this needs to call game button tapped command change can execute every time the property does change. So let's go back up here, because not only is this an observable property, but it also has to notify can execute changed for, and specifically our game button tapped command. So just by passing that in there, whoops, it's a string, so let's do name of. There we go. And now I can blow this away, delete, and you'll see that elsewhere in the code, like right here, this is can game button tapped command execute with a capital C. This is one with a lowercase c. And I didn't write this one down here, but we can actually click on it, say go to definition, and we're taken to the the generated source code. So super cool. Like this is the other partial class. And if you've never used partial classes before, I never did before .NET MAUI. The way partial classes work is essentially you're just splitting a class between two files, and then at compile time, the compiler just merges all that code together. So it's basically a way that the MVVM toolkit can write all this code for you and kind of stuff it into your view model. But again, this is all auto-generated, and you can see how much is auto-generated here for you. Things that like I don't even do normally in my app, which I mean I probably should do. But things like it's got all these methods like on can game button tap command execute changing, and it also calls on property changing. I never did that in my code, even though I know you're supposed to. I always just called on property changed. So this is this MVVM toolkit library is actually super highly optimized. Sergio, he's the maintainer on it, is super, super smart guy. Love him. He always writes all these benchmarks, and he'll measure memory allocations and CPU cycles to make sure that he's not adding anything extra. So you basically get all this amazing code, and it's super optimized for performance. But you might be thinking to yourself, like, well, wait a minute. Like, what if I want to do something when this Boolean changes, right? Because before I had the property where in the setter, I could have a little action when the property does change. Well, if we look closely here, there's all these partial methods. And again, partial methods, kind of weird. What does this mean? Well, basically what it means is this method is defined here in this part of the class. And then if we come back to our code over here, I can actually, he defined the method. I can implement the method. So I can say partial, let's see. Let's get this one right here. Whoops. I think it created it down here. There it is. There we go. So if we wanted to do something whenever the can game button tapped command execute changed, well, we can just say partial void, and now we can write any code we want. So we can say handle Boolean changed. And we can do that here. So you're not missing out on any functionality. If anything, you're getting more functionality because, like I said, Sergio and his source generators do way more than I ever did in my own code. So shout out to Sergio. Thank you for your awesome work. So let's keep going here. What else do we have? We've got a string game button text. So let's add the observable property there. And up here, I've got a bunch of ints. So this is kind of a cool thing, which you may or may not know, is if you define multiple ints in line, you only have to add that attribute on once. So, if you want to, you could separate them out, and you could have another int down here and add that observable property on it. But you don't have to. You can just do it all in line. And each of these now have generated source code for me. So yeah, we're getting yelled at because all these properties already exist. So let's blow these away. Let's blow these away. It feels so good. I love deleting code. As long as your app still works. I love deleting code. OK, what next? Oh, we have commands. So I'm still defining these commands here. We've got our game button tapped command. We've got our update high score command. But again, commands literally just point to a method. They're the most simplest thing in the world. So what we can do is, let's do this one first. So tap game button command, blow that away, and here is the method that we wanted to point it to. And we just say relay command, and that's basically it. Except here, we also have that can execute property. So we wanted to make sure we tie it into that bool, and that Boolean was called can game button execute. Oops. And if I do it right, we won't have any red squiggles. There we go. So if we still want to have that Boolean to enable, disable commands, we can do that. We just say can execute. We point it to whatever property, or you can even pass in name of a method. The source generators are smart enough to figure all this out. And again, if we go back and look at, how do we see this in the source code? I think we can go back to the page, back to the button. Yeah, and there it is. So there's our game button tapped command, which again, we never wrote any of this code. This is all generated for us. And like I said, this follows all the best practices. It's, delayed initialization, so you don't get any performance degradation at runtime. It's creating a new relay command for us. It knows to pass in an action that requires a string, because if you remember over here, game button tapped needs a nullable string. So it knows we're passing in an action with a nullable string, and here's our can execute value right there. So again, just amazing how easy this library is to use and how much code we're able to delete. So let's wrap it up here with one more command. What's that called? Update high score command. Slap this attribute on here. Boom. And now we've got a command, which I think I mentioned this earlier, but just in case I didn't, the way these source generators work, like I mentioned for the fields, they take the name of your field and either capitalize the first letter or remove the underscore and then capitalize the first letter. For commands, they take the name of your method. So this method's name is game button tapped, and then the command is going to be called game button tapped command. So keep that in mind. You don't want any naming conflicts in your app. But now, if we look at our code, like here's our diff in our GitHub desktop right here. Like, look how much code we deleted. Let's see if we can, show these side by side. So we just pulled out all this code from our view model. Like our view model went from, get rid of that. Our view model went from 88 lines of code down to 54 lines of code. So highly, highly recommend using the MVVM Toolkit if you're not already. And again, it's not even dependent on .NET MAUI, so you can use it wherever you want. As long as your app is in C# or .NET and you're using MVVM, the MVVM Community Toolkit works there too. OK. Real quick, shameless plug, but it's something I'm really proud of, and it's something that's super, super helpful. I recently published a .NET MAUI course to dometrain.com. Who here's heard of DomeTrain? Oh, cool, a couple folks. Anybody heard of Nick Chapsis? OK. It's a website that Nick set up. And you can kind of think of it like Pluralsight, but his goal was to get subject matter experts to make high-quality videos where you can learn mostly C# .NET stuff. There is some other like database things, entity framework stuff, API stuff. But Nick reached out and asked if I'd like to do this, and I said, absolutely, because this is something that I wish existed in the world. This is, if you can see it up there, almost 11 hours. It's 10 hours and 51 minutes of me hanging out talking with you. So yes, it is a paid course, but it's something I'm really proud of. It's tons and tons of value. And there's actually 2 courses separated. This is, I think, a discount if you buy the bundle. The first one, called Getting Started with .NET MAUI. This is, if you've never made a .NET MAUI app before, we literally start out, I'll show you how to install .NET MAUI in Visual Studio. That's where we're starting from. And then I teach you how to build that first app. We talk about what's a grid, what's a button, what's an entry, how does padding work, what is margin, basically how to create that first UI. But if you already do know .NET MAUI, still recommend we have the deep dive course here, where we get into all the things that aren't necessarily .NET MAUI, but they're all things we have to do in our MAUI apps, like local databases. What's the best way to make a REST API call? What's the best way to make a GraphQL API call? How do we save things locally, storage on device? How do we do unit tests for a .NET MAUI app? So this is a bit more advanced, but one of the things I love about this is even if you know all this stuff, there's probably something in there that'll be new, you'll learn. But even if you got all that, if you have somebody new join your team, sit them down with this course, give them a week to go through it, because we build that app together. And by the end of the week, they're going to be up and running. They're going to be a contributing member of your team. So highly recommend it. Like I said, this whole presentation, I'm very, very biased, but it is something I'm really proud of. I spent months and months and months putting this together, so I hope you love it too. And also, I mentioned earlier, we have monthly stand-ups. So this is a screenshot from our stand-up last month in August, or this month. And so if you ever have the time, if you're ever able to make it, our stand-ups always stream at the same time every month on the first Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. Pacific time. So keep that in mind. It's a little weird. It's just that's the time slot that the .NET Foundation gave us to live stream on their channel. So keep that in mind as time zones change, daylight saving comes and goes. It'll always be locked in 12 p.m. Pacific. So it might vary by an hour or so, depending on your time zone at certain times of year. But here's this, like I said, a screenshot of some of the fellow maintainers. There's a couple more of us out there too who just were on holiday, weren't able to make it to this month's meeting. But please come join us. This is not only where you can see what we're working on, what issues, what PRs are top of mind for us, but also you can hang out with us in the chat. You can ask us questions. This is the best place to come in and be like, hey, Brandon, that bug's been open for 90 days. What the heck, man? And then we can help, escalate that and raise that bug to help you get it fixed. Or we could even just talk about possible solutions and workarounds in real time. So please do come join us. And even if you can't make it, like I said, I always tweet out the YouTube link. And if you just subscribe to the .NET Foundation, go to youtube.com/c/NET Foundation. Then you'll always get the alerts anytime we go live. OK. Well, if you haven't already, now's the chance to take out your phones, make sure you grab a picture of this slide, this QR code, bookmark this website, because again, this is where you can find everything we talked about today. This is where you can find the slides. This is where you can find links to all the community toolkits, their docs. I've got a bunch of videos I've made on the toolkit. This is also where you can find links to that .NET MAUI course on DomeTrain if you're interested in learning more about that, as well as tons and tons of resources on the community toolkit as well. Thank you. I lost my mic. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think we got about 10 minutes, right? So did I see a question earlier in the back? I can't hear you if you... Or do we have a mic? Yeah. Oh, say Copilot? You know, I haven't. Has anybody seen Copilot give a completion for the toolkit stuff? I know it works for MAUI. So 100%, they have trained the Copilot for MAUI. Copilot's smart enough to actually know that you're in a .NET MAUI repo. And even if you ask it a question, what Visual Studio does under the hood, or I guess what Copilot does under the hood, is they'll slide in the word MAUI to make sure you don't get different code back. But I don't know. I don't know if they've trained it on the Community Toolkit, but that would be cool. Yeah, no, good question. Like I said, I work at AWS now, and we've got our own version of Copilot called Q. Is anybody using Q? Yeah, I didn't think so. Nobody's even heard of it, but yeah, that's what I get to use. Good question. What other questions do you guys have? Yes. Ooh. So the question was, C# 13 is introducing partial properties. So we saw partial classes, we saw partial methods. I assume it's basically the same with partial properties, same idea. There has been an issue opened on the MVVM Toolkit for 2 years now, because we were supposed to get partial properties in C# 12. They ended up just punting it to 13. So I hope so. Like I said, Sergio, he runs the MVVM Community Toolkit, but I gotta imagine he's gonna finally do it, because when that issue was opened, he basically said, yes, you're right, we should actually have this feature, but I really need partial properties to do it. And it's funny, because I subscribe to that issue, so I get alerts every time somebody comments on it. And people are like, well, why don't you just do this? And why don't you just do that? And he's like, yeah, we could. But again, like, he's so focused on optimization. He doesn't want extra allocations. And so he's like, the right way to do this is with partial properties. So I'll say I hope so, but I'm optimistic that he'll take advantage of those. Good question. Yeah?
Now that Visual Studio for Mac is dying,
Yes. Yeah, so the question was about, Visual Studio for Mac is being killed off, which is super sad, because I don't know how many folks know, that was actually called Xamarin Studio when we were still Xamarin. Then Microsoft acquired us, and somebody in the marketing team was like, oh, we could rebrand this as Visual Studio for Mac. And all of us were like, no, don't do it, because it only was made for Xamarin. Like, once you call it Visual Studio for Mac, people are going to expect you can do, Azure stuff in it, ASP.NET Core apps in it, and that's not what it was made for. So they did it anyways. And then people tried to use it, and they're like, what is this? This tool sucks. It can't do anything Visual Studio can do. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's for Xamarin. So yeah, they're finally killing it off after basically killing it back then by just like ruining the branding, the name, with setting those expectations too high, I guess is a better way to put it. So yeah, I mean, what I use now is Rider. That was what I was doing all my code in. Yeah, Microsoft recommends using VS Code. It gets better every day, but I haven't tried it in a couple months. But every time I'm like, well, let me try it out again. And it's just like, things are in different places, and there's still not like all the functionality there. Rider's amazing. Arguably better in certain things than Visual Studio. So that's what I use. That's what I recommend. I do pay for it. I don't know if Rider has a free tier. No, yeah. So, I mean, you could always do something like this. Like, obviously I'm on a Mac here, and let's see if this will work. I've got Parallels installed. So this is just a virtual machine, and I don't have it set up on this account. Well, on my other account, I just use Parallels as a virtual machine to run Windows on my Mac. So I install Windows inside of parallels, and then I can use Visual Studio in there. So that's probably the best option, because then you're on the Mac, so you have to do that connect to Mac thing in Visual Studio anytime you're working on iOS apps and stuff like that. And since you're literally on Windows, on the Mac, it's super easy to connect. So that's probably the best way to do it. I think you can use Parallels for free, and Visual Studio has a free tier. But yeah, I was super bummed when I heard they were killing Visual Studio for Mac, because I was like, oh, great, I guess I have to pay for Rider. And they killed App Center, killing App Center too. And it's like, oh, great, well, I guess I have to pay for Sentry. So we get to pay more money now for all the same things. And oh, actually, speaking of paying for things, I should have mentioned that Dome Train course. If you have a Visual Studio subscription, Nick has a partnership with Visual Studio. I don't know if you need Enterprise, I don't know the levels and the details, but you can get half off. So if you go to your Visual Studio account, you'll see like half off Dome Train. I don't know how it all works, if it's a coupon code or ties to your account, but if you are interested in that .NET MAUI course, make sure you get half off, because why not, right? All right, yeah, we got about 5 more minutes. If there's any questions, happy to hang around. I'll be here all week. You can always find me. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that there is an attempt to revive the Visual Studio for Mac mono-develop server studio lineage that's called .develop. But it haven't had that much traction, so I guess if someone really wants to see it revive, they can help out with the project.
Cool. For anybody that didn't hear, well, I guess fill in everybody. Their Xamarin Studio was actually based on a different IDE called MonoDevelop. That was like the first C# IDE, and it's all open source. You probably know more about it than I do. But then Xamarin Studio was built on top of that. And so you're saying you've actually built a Visual Studio for Mac on top of MonoDevelop.
The Visual Studio for Mac was formed from Xamarin Studio.
Right.
Branding kind of thing of mono-develop. So there's a new open source project that attempts to revive it from the last public open source release.
Cool.
That's called .develop.
.develop. OK. Check out .develop. That's good to know. Or, you could pay for Rider. It is worth it. It's a great IDE. I kind of wish I'd ditched Visual Studio for Mac sooner. Yeah.
Can you combine the Rider on Windows and Mac and use the
Yeah, like the same activation code.
No, but if you're on a Rider on a Windows machine, writing your MAUI project, can you connect to a MacBook and then debug on an iPhone?
It's got to, right? Has anybody used JetBrains Rider on Windows and connected to a Mac? I don't know. I always just use Visual Studio on Windows. I mean, it's the best. Good question. All right. Well, thanks so much, gang. Like I said, I'll be around all week. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any more questions, but happy to chat with you if you see me around. Thanks again.